Thank you. Where's the band when you need it? When I heard the sounds of those brass instruments, I thought about Bruno Mars and wondered if he might be skipping down the aisle. What a joyous day, nevertheless. To Teachers College Board of Trustees, led by co-chairs John Hyland and William Ruckert, to President Susan Furman, to Provost Tom James, to Professor Michelle Knight-Manuel, who just introduced me, to all the amazing faculty, administrators, and staff, thank you for the honor of this prestigious award and for the opportunity to address the Teachers College Doctoral class of 2017. To the graduates, I know what it feels like to have started something that felt at times like an impossible journey. To the parents and grandparents, I know what it means from watching my own to question and wonder if your big kid was up to the task. So take another collective moment on your last day as a cohort to acknowledge all of your accomplishments. Now, tomorrow the real work begins, and it isn't just about getting jobs or starting jobs with your newly minted or printed doctorates. The real work is about putting on your big girl pants and meeting the challenges we face in this world. Before I forget, also let me thank my parents and my sister Pilar, and my family, including my wife Stephanie, and my daughter Justice, who are supporting me here today. All right, we won't get through this if you keep applauding. I've been thinking a lot about how to define those challenges in order to address them. So I want to share with you for a few moments what I've come up with. Let me start with a big idea. What if we thought about education as universal health care? I know that part of becoming an expert in the field is knowing which peg goes into which hole. Healthcare and education are not the same. But what if we thought about them in relation to one another in a more intentional way? Many of you have heard that there is a measles outbreak in Minneapolis. There are 48 confirmed cases, and nearly all are Somali American children under 10, 45 of whom were not vaccinated. In any given state, annually there are 1 or 2 confirmed cases, just to illustrate the dire nature of this crisis. So what happened? Turns out that within this population, the largest in the United States, there is tremendous misinformation about the link between vaccinations and autism. The fear of autism isn't just within this community. Recent outbreaks among unvaccinated children have happened in Disneyland and a Texas megachurch. So what about other, less obvious connections between education and healthcare, where things aren't so immediate or predictable? Social psychologists have made great strides identifying how powerful implicit bias is in perpetuating institutional discrimination against all sorts of people, from the impoverished or the disabled to gender non-conforming and people of color. Remember the Yale study a few months ago that found discrimination among teachers of preschool-age Black boys? Health researchers have documented that the toll discrimination takes, often in the form of microaggressions, creates an elevated stress level and raises blood pressure. In a nutshell, a sick society makes people sick. So what's your role, graduates? In your various fields, you're going to train the teachers to teach our students how to take their place in the world, presumably to make a healthier society. But what if we've reached a moment in our history when making us a healthier society is too costly? I mean, after all, if the Affordable Care Act is too costly to a majority of politicians in Washington, why should we be surprised that education might be too costly as well? Our new Secretary of Education wants to bring private sector efficiencies to our public schools, right? So notice how easily my question presupposes that cost should drive who learns and ultimately who lives. Teachers College's own John Dewey reminds us that a society with too few independent thinkers is vulnerable to control by disturbed and opportunistic leaders. A society which wants to create and maintain a free and democratic social system must create responsible independence of thought among its young. The assumption that cost is the best arbiter of value in society is gospel today, not a choice. It is a new gospel of wealth for the public sector. It is not subject to the scrutiny of independent thought, certainly not on any scale I recognize. Let me be clear. The goal here is not to conscript every student and every citizen to social justice and human rights work. The goal here is to build a new foundation of shared values and collective memory, because the foundation we have is flawed. Its cracks and fissures are irreversible. Think of it like this. As a New Jersey Transit commuter, the pending infrastructure crisis that faces the Hudson River tunnels will eventually paralyze the region. It could not be a more apt metaphor for the perils we face as a nation within a global community. It is beyond time to rebuild. We are way beyond the half-life of American exceptionalism 1.0. I don't believe we can solve any of our problems in any enduring way based on the old origin story. Everything will be fragile and short-lived, subject to the whims and caprice of those who control the market of ideas, of real estate, of our transportation networks, of the financial sector, of electoral politics. So here's what I propose. I want your help writing a new origin story for this nation. I don't mean a fat book or series of lectures or a screenplay that Steven Spielberg might option for an epic film. I mean a revised civic lesson on the model that President Furman has already begun. A new meta-narrative, something on a scale never attempted in the country to revise American exceptionalism, the kind we've all been taught. The good news is Teachers College has already committed itself to this work, but you're leaving. So remember, practically speaking, how do we take 50 years of social history from the margins of our K through 16 educational system and put it at the center? This isn't just about Howard Zinn's People History of the United States, though I'll take that over what is currently taught. This is about committing ourselves to historical and humanistic literacy that draws on advances in historical reasoning, archival evidence, and literary analysis that reflects what we have learned over a half century. Too often we treat history like it is an opinion. I've served on national and local committees to solve this problem or that, and I've watched educated people evoke their own experience as historical proof. We all have opinions, but we are not all historically literate, never mind fluent. The same problem of climate change denial holds in how most Americans think about our past. We at least give economists and environmentalists a chance to shake our beliefs. Historians, not so much. Admittedly, there is no trans-ideological view of the past. The questions we ask, the evidence we seek, the data we collect, the frames we choose, the audiences we write for and against all make history messy. These biases make our empirical work messy too, despite the ubiquity of big data and transcendent claims of objectivity. But that messiness is exactly what we have to wrestle with at the earliest possible age if our citizens are to be global humanists, if they are to see themselves in a larger story where they have agency, where they make choices, and where they may choose to minimize inequality and maximize health as a moral or ethical imperative. The former editor of Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham, wrote a few years ago in the magazine that there is an increasingly illiterate populace to be as poorly informed about American history as they are about the history of ancient Egypt or modern Uzbekistan. 76% of college graduates unfamiliar with the Bill of Rights, 73 respondents unable to identify America's antagonists during the 4 decades of the Cold War. He said Americans have a wonderful talent for what he called grand simplification. Why then argue for uses of history other than the ones that sponsor election campaigns, blow the bubbles on Wall Street, underwrite the nation's wars? Here we are 63 years to the day on the anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. But in 2011, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that in a sample of 12,000 high school seniors, only 2% could identify correctly the answers to a 2-part question. What was Brown versus Board, and why does it matter? They also noted that 16 states require no teaching of civil rights history, 19 others did so little that they graded them as failures, and only 3 were considered model states. In 1948, the great Harvard-trained historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois told a room full of black men, people he called the talented 10th, his Sigma Pi Phi or Boule brothers, that they must choose personhood over profit if they were to help improve the conditions of African Americans. The same message, unfortunately, still applies. Nearly 60 years later, the journalist Ellis Coase analyzed the mood of black America on the topic of race relations in the opening months of the Obama presidency. He held focus groups, did extensive interviewing, and mined available polling research to understand how 3 generations of African Americans saw the future. His 2 groups were black Harvard Business School alumni and graduates of A Better Chance, a preparatory and pipeline to elite boarding school program for promising underprivileged youth. These are the same people today who were the target audiences for W.E.B. Du Bois so many decades ago. But the key insight of Ellis Coase's work came in an appendix. Black Harvard Business School alumni's 10 rules for success, and here I offer 4. Rule number 1, you can only go so far as your networks will take you. Rule number 4, embrace self-discipline and perseverance as virtues. All traits of character demonstrated here today by our graduates. Rule number 7, cultivate people who are more powerful and important than yourself. Rule number 10, never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, other than to declare that race or gender does not matter. Isn't rule number 10 the grandest of simplifications? This isn't just about black people, to be sure. The problem of historical illiteracy widens inequality in every direction. Because you see, blackness is at the foundation of this nation's very conception of freedom, of liberty, of property, of democracy. The institution of slavery wasn't a bump on the road, to quote Ta-Nehisi Coates. It was the road. Slavery not only degraded black people, it degraded the humanity of whites. These institutions made some rich and subsidized the social mobility of many other whites, but slavery made no one a better person. And it sickened all of us to the point of a devastating war that is still playing out in the hearts and minds, in the halls of government, and on the streets of New Orleans today. Channeling the late historian John Hope Franklin, glad he's already been evoked, Harvard President Drew Faust wrote in a New York Review of Book essay, Race and the Meaning of America, that fundamental to the task at hand would be rewriting the history of history, revising the hallowed falsehoods, illustrating how the abuse and misuse of history served to legitimate systems of oppression, not just in the past, but in the present as well. Until we have a new history, we cannot build a different and better future, Faust states. It is history that has the capacity to save us. After all, this is about my children, your children, our students especially. This is about the world we will help build with them. We can't fix inequality if we rear children to value inequality. The writer Junot Diaz told me that from teaching at MIT, those very learned students, he's learned that history is our weakest muscle. He's right. If we invest and insist on the historical literacy of all our children, they will change our origin story, our narrative of inequality, of winners and losers, makers and takers. They will make political and economic decisions that value personhood over profit. In a recent essay, Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale, now a Hulu special series, writes that the control of women and babies has been a feature of every repressive regime on the planet. But she notes in writing The Handmaid's Tale that the act of writing is also an act of hope. Every recorded story, she says, implies a future reader. I'm inspired by her, and I hope you are too. I often see the frustration of people when I tell them that teaching our history as a moral, ethical, and what I consider to be a public health imperative is the best way forward. As a solution, history education lacks a certain kind of vigor or robustness or immediacy. It feels inadequate to the crisis of the moment. Literature and art, of course, serve the same function, though history is generally the starting point for great works of art. Still, I insist that this is the only way forward because it is all we have in an open society. Democracy requires us to accommodate opposition, including willful ignorance, intolerance, and the want of erasure or domination. Democracy must accommodate the will of the people, even if that will desecrates the spirit of democracy. A lesson, I'm afraid, only illustrates my point. The want of influence over the hearts and minds of others is humanity at its essence. It's why we are storytelling creatures. The right to petition, to free speech, to assembly are the tools of persuasion and the most cherished rights of our constitutional democracy. However, neither the political right nor the left should force people to think or do anything. The right to persuasion is one thing, just as the right to dissent is another. Both are sacrosanct. This means we are stuck living in a world where the lack of historical illiteracy and anti-intellectualism are far more potent forces for intolerance, bigotry, and anti-democratic impulses than anything a political party or authoritarian leader can impose on the American people. In other words, we imprison ourselves. Political elites of every stripe profit electorally and in their governance by this. Leaders only want to be questioned so much as it matches their political or legislative or administrative goals. There are, of course, exceptions. So we as parents or as first teachers must teach. We as professional teachers must educate. We as journalists must inform, and we as citizens must inquire. It is both the questioning and the curiosity in the end that will save us. As long as we keep talking, we aren't killing each other. Erasure and forgetting are far greater threats to our shared humanity than any act of force. Silence rewards ignorance and intolerance. Propaganda is a symptom of this greater problem, not a cause. Dr. King once said that the great evil of erasure, of forgetting the contributions of the Negro in America, was, in his own words, cultural homicide. He believed, as I do, that no struggle for civil rights, for human rights, could succeed in a transformative way without establishing, first, the former slaves' humanity. Without that, everything built on the shallow foundation of a so-called damaged people in need of fixing or reform or a new program or a better school or body cameras or mentoring would fail in the end. Pets can be trained and loved like human beings, but they can never be human. To recognize the slave or the sharecropper or the sales clerk or the formerly incarcerated as a human being is to recognize they are you. We are they. In every other Western democracy, that is, places whose cultural and political heritage informed the founding of this nation, the most basic belief that the least, the last, and the lost can never be collectively guilty, certainly since the Enlightenment, is true because the mass indictment would be an indictment of the nation. It would be mass criminalization, an act of collective self-destruction. The will for self-preservation is a universal desire to survive, to save oneself, one's family, one's kin, one's country. Years ago, I remember driving down Monument Boulevard in Richmond, Virginia. It was a summer trip from New Jersey to a small town about an hour south of the former Confederate capital. We were there to see an old friend from Indiana, where we had just moved from, who was getting married. My children were 5, 9, and 11 at the time. We toured the city block by block, noting the architecture, the parks, the extremes of wealth and poverty, but none of it compared to the horror of the monuments of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and the like. Come to think of it, wasn't Brown doomed to fail across the landscape of this great nation, covered in hundreds and hundreds of Confederate monuments? So the good news is those monuments are coming down. Those statues of hate and intolerance are being dismantled as we speak. That the lessons learned for the young people who make up so many social and racial justice movements unfolding right behind our eyes are the evidence of the good works that happen in our nation's classrooms. We just have to do more. We have to be more intentional. So go out, TC class of 2017, use your doctorate like a physician would. Make us all smarter and healthier. Thank you.